Have you ever thought of a perfect couple? In work, in life, or in music? For bluegrass fans, that image is Wilma Lee and Stoney Cooper. For 36 years, they were not only husband and wife, but also a legendary singing duo, their voices blending as one on the Opry stage. But imagine what would happen if one day, half your voice, half your life, suddenly disappeared forever. That was the tragedy that befell Wilma Lee Cooper. Today's story is not just about a star. It's about a woman who had to learn to stand alone in the spotlight and find her own voice after the fateful duet of her life ended. To understand Wilma Lee, you have to understand the world that made her. Imagine the West Virginia mountains in the early 1920s. This wasn't the romantic pastoral ideal you might see in a painting. This was a hard place. Life was carved out of coal, timber, and stubborn faith. The Great Depression hadn't officially started yet, but for the people of Appalachia, economic hardship was a constant companion, a fact of life as reliable as the changing seasons. In these isolated hollows and small towns, entertainment wasn't something you bought. It was something you made. It was the story told on the porch, the fiddle played by the fireside, and most importantly, the song sung in church. This is the world Wilma Leigh Leary was born into on February 7th, 1921, in the tiny community of Valley Head, West Virginia. Her father, Jacob, was a farmer and a musician. Her mother, whose maiden name was Cooper, was a singer. Music wasn't a hobby in the Leary household. It was a language, a currency, a form of prayer. From a young age, Wilma Lee and her sisters Jerry and Peggy were immersed in the rich tapestry of mountain music. These were songs that had crossed the Atlantic with early settlers, mutating and evolving in the isolation of the hills. They were gospel hymns that promised a better world to come, and tragic ballads that spoke of the harsh realities of this one. Her father formed the family into a professional act, branding them with his wife's maiden name for its musical ring, the Singing Cooper family. This wasn't some casual weekend affair. They were serious traveling performers. Jacob Leary was a demanding bandleader who instilled a powerful work ethic in his children. They played at church gatherings, community events, and on local radio stations, which were becoming the new lifelines of rural America. Wilma Lee learned to play the guitar, her small hands finding their way around the fretboard, but it was her voice that was the true revelation. It was a force of nature, clear, strong, and filled with a raw, emotional power that belied her young age. It was a voice that didn't just sing the notes, it carried the weight of the stories within the songs. She wasn't performing a tradition, she was living it. This upbringing forged in her an unshakable musical identity. She would never be a polished Nashville pop singer. She was and always would be a mountain singer with all the grit, soul, and authenticity that implied. In the world of traveling musicians, paths are always crossing. In 1938, a gifted fiddle player from Harmon, West Virginia named Dale T. Cooper, who went by the stage name Stoney, auditioned for a spot on a radio show where the Leary family was performing. There was no relation, despite the Cooper name. He was a talented instrumentalist, but when he heard Wilma Lee's voice, something clicked. Soon after, he joined the Leary family band. The musical chemistry between the fiery young singer and the steady fiddle man was immediate and undeniable. Their harmonies locked in perfectly, and his fiddle seemed to weave itself around her voice, creating a sound that was both traditional and thrillingly alive. But the chemistry wasn't just musical. A romance blossomed against a backdrop of dusty roads, small-town stages, and the shared ambition of making a life in music. In 1941, Wilma Lee Leary became Wilma Lee Cooper, and one of country music's most enduring partnerships was born. They soon broke away from the family band to forge their own path as Wilma Lee and Stoney Cooper. Their early years were a grind, a classic story of paying their dues. They moved from one radio station to another across the South, honing their craft and building a following. This was the era before television, when radio was king. A regular spot on a powerful station could make you a star. Their big break came in 1947 when they landed a coveted spot on the WWVA Jamboree in Wheeling, West Virginia. The Jamboree was a powerhouse, a rival to Nashville's Grand Ole Opry. Broadcast on a 50,000-watt Clear Channel station, its signal boomed across the eastern United States and Canada every Saturday night. For the next 10 years, Wilma Lee and Stoney were the undisputed stars of the Jamboree. They were royalty in Wheeling. Their band, the Clinch Mountain Clan, became one of the tightest, most respected ensembles in the business. They specialized in what was then called old-time or mountain music, a style that would soon be codified as bluegrass. But unlike many of the early bluegrass acts, which were often all-male instrumental showcases, their sound was built around Wilma Lee's powerhouse vocals. She was the focal point, a charismatic and commanding presence on stage. While Stoney was the quiet, masterful bandleader, Wilma Lee was the fire. They began recording for Columbia Records and later Hickory Records, producing a string of hits that have since become standards of the genre. Songs like Walking My Lord Up Calvary Hill, The Legend of the Dogwood Tree, and 30 Pieces of Silver cemented their reputation as masters of the gospel ballad. These weren't just songs, they were powerful 4-minute sermons set to music, delivered with an emotional intensity that could bring an audience to tears. One of their most iconic recordings, 30 Pieces of Silver, perfectly captures their appeal. The song, a retelling of Judas's betrayal of Jesus, is stark and dramatic. Wilma Lee's voice doesn't just narrate the story, it inhabits it. You can hear the anguish, the condemnation, the sorrow. It was this ability to convey deep, raw emotion that set her apart. She wasn't just singing about faith and tragedy, she was testifying. They also had major secular hits that showcased their versatility, like Cheated 2, Big Midnight Special, and their biggest chart success, Come Walk With Me. But through it all, they remained defiantly traditional. As the Nashville Sound began to smooth out the rough edges of country music with lush strings and pop-influenced arrangements, Wilma Lee and Stoney doubled down on their raw mountain sound. They were a direct link to the music's roots, and their audience loved them for it. Finally, in 1957, the call they had been waiting for came. The Grand Ole Opry, the undisputed mother church of country music, invited them to become members. Leaving their kingdom in Wheeling for a spot in Nashville was a huge decision, but it was the culmination of everything they had worked for. Stepping into that famous circle on the stage of the Ryman Auditorium, Wilma Lee and Stoney Cooper had officially arrived at the pinnacle of their profession. They became beloved fixtures of the Opry, representing the institution's traditional heart and soul for the next 2 decades. Their life was a whirlwind of touring, recording, and Saturday nights at the Opry. They raised a daughter, Carol Lee, who would eventually join them on stage, continuing the family tradition. To the outside world, their life seemed like a perfect country song, a story of love, family, and musical success all tied together in a perfect harmony. But as with all the best country songs, heartbreak was waiting just around the corner. For 36 years, Wilma Lee's world had Stoney Cooper at its center. He wasn't just her husband. He was her band leader, her business manager, her musical anchor, and her best friend. On stage, His steady presence and masterful fiddle playing provided the foundation upon which her soaring voice could fly. Off stage, he handled the contracts, the bookings, the logistics, all the unglamorous work that allowed her to focus on being the artist. Theirs was a partnership in the truest sense of the word. In the mid-1970s, that foundation began to crack. Stoney's health started to decline. Years of hard living on the road had taken their toll. He suffered from a series of illnesses, including a heart condition that left him progressively weaker. For a time, they tried to hide it. Stoney would push himself to perform even when he was in pain, unwilling to let down the audience or his wife. There are poignant accounts from fellow Opry members who remembered seeing the strain on his face backstage, only to watch him summon the energy to walk out into the lights and play his part. Wilma Lee watched the man who had always been her rock slowly fade. She took on more of the responsibility both on stage and off, trying to carry the load for both of them, but the decline was irreversible. In 1977, after a prolonged illness, Stoney Cooper passed away at the age of 58. Wilma Lee had lost her partner in every conceivable way. She was 56 years old, a widow, and for the first time in her adult life, she was professionally alone. The act Wilma Lee and Stoney Cooper was over. Many in Nashville assumed, and perhaps even expected, that she would quietly retire. The industry was notoriously tough on older artists, especially women, and the thought of her continuing without Stoney seemed almost inconceivable. The two were so intertwined in the public imagination that one without the other felt incomplete. But those people fundamentally misunderstood the woman from the West Virginia mountains. Giving up was not in her nature. The same grit and determination that had been forged in her during those early years with the singing Cooper family now rose to the surface. Music wasn't just what she did, it was who she was. To stop singing would have been a kind of death in itself. In an interview years later, she reflected on that period with her characteristic directness. Someone asked her if she ever considered quitting. She said, "Quit? What was I going to do? That's all I know. That's my life. I had to go on." It was that simple and that profound. So summoning a reserve of courage she may not have even known she possessed, Wilma Lee Cooper returned to the Grand Ole Opry stage as a solo artist, walking out into the same spotlight in front of the same audience, but with a gaping empty space beside her where Stoney had always stood. She had to reform her band, take over the business arrangements, and find a way to recontextualize songs that were steeped in decades of shared history. Her daughter Carol Lee stepped up to sing harmony, her voice a beautiful echo of the family's legacy. But it wasn't the same. Wilma Lee's performances took on a new emotional depth. When she sang the old gospel songs about loss and perseverance, it was no longer just a performance. It was a raw public testimony of her own grief and faith. She poured her loneliness and her strength into the music, and the audience felt it. They rallied around her, their applause a show of support for her incredible resilience. She didn't just preserve the music, she embodied it. She became a living symbol of the enduring spirit of bluegrass, refusing to let the flame go out. She was no longer just part of a legendary duo. She was the matriarch of the genre, the undisputed First Lady of Bluegrass, holding court on the Opry stage, a solitary, defiant, and brilliant star. Wilma Lee Cooper's life was never really scandalous. She was a woman of deep faith and unwavering professionalism. The battles she fought were not with addiction or tabloid headlines, but with something more subtle and perhaps more profound, the relentless march of time and changing tastes. The controversy, if you can call it that, was in her steadfast refusal to compromise her musical identity. By the 1960s and 70s, The Nashville music machine was in full swing, churning out a new product known as the Nashville Sound. Pioneered by producers like Chet Atkins and Owen Bradley, it was a deliberate attempt to make country music more palatable to a mainstream pop audience. The fiddles and steel guitars were replaced with smooth string sections. The raw nasal vocals of mountain singers were smoothed over by lush crooning voices and background choirs. It was a commercially successful formula that created superstars like Patsy Cline, Jim Reeves, and Eddie Arnold. In this environment, artists like Wilma Lee and Stoney Cooper were increasingly seen as relics. Their music was too raw, too rural, too country. Record executives would pressure them to update their sound, to add strings, to soften their hard-edged Appalachian delivery. They politely but firmly refused every item. To them, this wasn't a matter of commercial strategy, it was a matter of cultural integrity. The music they played was a sacred trust, a tradition passed down through generations, and they felt a deep responsibility to preserve it in its purest form. This decision had consequences. While their Opry performances remained beloved, their commercial recording career dwindled. They were legends, but they were legends from a bygone era in an industry obsessed with the next new thing. After Stoney's death, this pressure on Wilma Lee only intensified. As a solo artist, she could have reinvented herself, adopted a more contemporary style, and perhaps chased a second wave of chart success. She never even considered it. Instead, she became an even more fierce guardian of the traditional sound. Her stage at the Opry became a sanctuary for authentic bluegrass and old-time gospel. She would often express a quiet disappointment in the direction modern country music was headed. In one archival interview, she remarked, "A lot of what they call country music today, I don't know what it is, but it's not country, not the country I know." There was no bitterness in her voice, only a sad resolve. Her most immediate legacy is her title, the First Lady of Bluegrass. It's a title she earned not just by being a woman in the genre, but by being a leader in the genre. In the early days of bluegrass, it was a world dominated by men. Bill Monroe, Flatt, and Scruggs, the Stanley brothers. These were instrumental wizards who often treated the vocalist as just another component of the band. Wilma Lee, however, was an undeniable frontwoman. She proved that a woman's voice could be the driving force of a hard-driving bluegrass band. Her powerful, assertive singing style broke down barriers and created a blueprint for generations of female artists who followed. From Dolly Parton and Emmylou Harrison country to Alison Krauss and Rhonda Vincent in bluegrass, every powerful female voice in the genre owes a debt to the trail Wilma Lee blazed. She demonstrated that a woman could be both traditional and tough, commanding a stage with nothing but her voice and her conviction. Furthermore, Wilma Lee Cooper was a vital cultural preservationist. The songs she and Stoney performed and recorded were not just entertainment. They were historical documents. They sang ballads that were hundreds of years old, gospel hymns that had sustained their ancestors through unimaginable hardship, and story songs that captured the folklore of Appalachia. In an era when many of these traditions were in danger of being forgotten, they gave them a national platform on the radio and on the stage of the Opry. They kept the music alive, ensuring that it would be discovered by the folk revivalists of the 1960s and by future generations of musicians. But perhaps her most profound significance lies in her story after Stoney. Her solo career became a powerful statement about resilience and the enduring power of music. She showed the world that a woman's identity did not have to end with the loss of her partner. She transformed her personal grief into a source of artistic strength, her performances becoming deeper and more meaningful. She became a beloved elder stateswoman at the Opry, a living embodiment of the institution's history and its commitment to its roots. Young musicians would seek her out backstage, hoping to absorb some of her wisdom and authenticity. She wasn't just a singer anymore, she was a monument. Her continued presence on that stage was a weekly reminder of where country music came from and what it could be at its best: honest, soulful, and true. For 24 years, Wilma Lee Cooper walked onto the Grand Ole Opry stage alone. She carried the weight of her past, the ghost of her husband's harmony, and the torch of traditional music for a new generation. The stage was her sanctuary, the one place where the loneliness might have receded, replaced by the warmth of the spotlight and the love of the audience. It was the place she was most herself, the place where she was born to be. And it was on that very stage that her life song would come to its sudden tragic end. It was February 24th, 2001. Wilma Lee, now 80 years old but still possessing that powerful, unwavering voice, was in the middle of a performance at the Opry. She was singing an old gospel tune, her voice filling the hallowed hall as it had thousands of times before. And then, in an instant, it stopped. Mid-song, mid-note, the voice that had defined her life was silenced. She collapsed on the stage. She had suffered a massive stroke right there, in the famous circle, in front of a live audience. The ultimate irony was as cruel as it was poetic. The mountain singer who had given her entire life to her voice was robbed of it in the very act of using it, in the one place on earth she considered sacred. She survived, but her performing career was over. The stroke left her unable to speak clearly, let alone sing. The powerful instrument that had been her gift to the world, her voice, was gone. She was forced into retirement, away from the stage that had been her home. The final decade of her life passed in forced silence. For someone who had lived her entire life in sound, it was a tragic and heartbreaking end. Finally, on September 13th, 2011, at her home in Sweetwater, Tennessee, Wilma Lee Cooper passed away peacefully of natural causes. She was 90. News of her passing sent shock waves through the country and bluegrass music community. Though fans had not heard her live for a decade, her death marked the true end of an era. The Grand Ole Opry, her spiritual home for more than 40 years, has officially lost one of its great godmothers. In the nights that followed, artists paid tribute to her with words and moments of silence, their voices filling the void she left behind. Tributes poured in from all over. Musicians, from her contemporaries to the younger generation she inspired, praised her not only for her unique voice, but also for her uncompromising spirit. For fans, the grief was more personal. In online forums and on memorial radio shows, they shared memories of seeing her in Stoney perform, of the way she closed her eyes as she sang, seemingly pouring her soul into each word. They spoke of meeting her backstage, of her warmth and authenticity. Their grief was not just for a lost artist. It was a mourning for a part of their own memories, for the songs that had accompanied them through life's ups and downs. Ultimately, Wilma Lee Cooper's life is a true reflection of her music. It is a story of faith overcoming loss and strength in the face of adversity, of